Interpreting, modern interpreting. The birth of interpreting as it has come to be known today. But we're talking about spoken language interpreting, not sign language interpreting or ASL to English interpreting. This is spoken language interpreting. And we're going to talk about it as originating at the Nuremberg trials. Before we get to the Nuremberg trials, though, I want to give you an overview of international conference interpreting. Now, prior to World War I, and we remember World War I was 1918-ish, right? Before that, French was the only official diplomatic language, meaning anytime there was a conference that took place or world powers got together, the only official language was French. So if there was a conference and a country wanted to send a representative to the conference, they would have to know how to speak French or understand French. If they didn't, they used to communicate through a written medium. They would write back and forth, write notes back and forth, or they would use dispatch individuals to bring messages back and forth. So that was the beginning of the international conference. And then in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference happened, and this is what we will often consider the beginning of conference interpreting. At this conference, English was recognized as an official language, and
what was recognized?
English, spoken English, or written spoken English was recognized as an official language, and that forever created the need for oral interpreters in international conferences. Because now we had two languages, French and English. So with that in mind, in order for everyone to access communication, they needed spoken language interpreters at all international conferences. Again, 1919. So because of this, we needed, as a profession, professional, trained spoken language interpreters. Hence, the beginning of interpreter education programs or interpreting schools. And the very first one was in Geneva, Switzerland in 1941. So that's a pretty big gap.
When
Paris,
was the year? I'm sorry.
1941. That's a pretty big gap. The Paris Peace Conference happened in 1919 when we had the need for interpreters, but it wasn't for 30 years later that they actually started officially training professional spoken language interpreters. So before anybody graduated from the Geneva School, those individuals functioning as interpreters were really what we call ad hoc interpreters. An individual that knew both languages and possibly something about world politics, economics, so that they had some information about what it was that they were interpreting. Around the same time, the same kind of time frame, 1931 saw the establishment of the League of Nations. And in 1945, a charter was written creating the United Nations. So now we're turning into a global society. But remember, this is way before the internet, or the World Wide Web. So when we did communicate with people from other countries, with other cultures and languages, we came together at international conferences. So the United Nations now recognizes the need for multiple interpretations for multiple languages. But one thing that's really interesting to note is that these interpreters only worked in a consecutive interpreting mode. The advent or the advancement of simultaneous interpreting had not happened yet. The invention of simultaneous interpreting took place at the League of Nations, and it was through a technological advancement called the IBM Hushaphone system. It was created by Philene Finley, two interpreters, and it was patented in 1926. This Hushaphone system was permanently installed in the League of Nations.
Sorry, can you say the year that it was patented?
1926. Okay. So the system was permanently installed in the League of Nations. So there were headsets, wired systems, channels to switch depending on what language you wanted the interpretation in. There were private booths for the interpreters in the back of the assembly hall. 1926, that's a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things, still relatively new. When you think of other professions, doctors, lawyers, our profession and the establishment of our profession is still in its infancy. So once we had the Hushaphone system, now interpretation could take place in a simultaneous mode. It no longer had to be consecutive because the languages, spoken languages, wouldn't be overlapping each other in a big assembly hall. Everybody had their own headsets and only needed to hear the language that they understood. But it wasn't true simultaneous interpreting yet, not in the way that we understand it today. Simultaneous, successive interpreting is what they used. What that means is the original speaker, say they were speaking French, and they were presenting a paper on a new water system for the world at the League of Nations. So the French presenter would stand up, give his presentation in spoken French, while everybody else waited. When that presenter was finished, then all the interpreters would render their interpretation of that speech into their target language. So all the interpretations were happening at the same time, but it wasn't simultaneous with the source or with the original speech. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now, simultaneous interpreting as we know it today began back in October of 1943 at the United Nations War Crimes Commission. And this is what led to the Nuremberg trials. In August of 1945, at the end of World War II, an international military tribunal got together, meaning military judges from all of the allied or the friendly countries came together in an attempt to set up a trial to judge the Germans and the Nazi Party. They determined that the Nazis would be charged with crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and conventional war crimes. The military tribunal selected the town of Nuremberg, and interestingly, the town of Nuremberg was decimated from the war. One of the only buildings left standing that was unscathed was their courthouse. So the Nuremberg trials began on November 20th of 1945. They're 1945, November 20th, 1945. The defendants were 24 Nazi criminals. Of them, some pretty big names. Hermann Göring, G-O-R-I-N-G. Rudolf Hess, H-E-S-S. And Joachim von Ribbentrop. It's V-O-N-R-I-P-P-E-N-T-R-O-P, von Ribbentrop. The trial itself lasted 10 months, and there were 216 trial days. Now, the Nuremberg trials were conducted in 4 languages: English, French, German. Anybody else know the 4th one? Russian? Russian. Thank you. Those 4 languages and interpretations into those 4 languages were used for pre-trial interrogations or questioning, courtroom interpreting, written translations, and sight translations of written documents. This was an amazing undertaking. Again, remember, if you think about it today, we think about the advances in the technology that we have, doesn't seem like it would be that difficult. This is 1945, after the world was just involved in a huge war. There's no satellite systems and World Wide Web and cell phones. They used, telegraphs still back then. They used Morse code on ships and warships fighting in the war. So this was amazing, the advances in technology at this time. So the system that they used at Nuremberg for the interpreters was called a wired system. Again, it wasn't wireless. There was no such thing as wireless back then. So they had wires, cables running all over the floors throughout the courtroom. And the wires were color-coded. They were color-coded based on the language. So there were 4 different colors. There were headphones attached to these wires, strewn all over the courtroom. 6 microphones were used. They also had a system of warning lights to assist the interpreters. A yellow would be a warning for whoever was speaking at the moment to please slow down. And a red light, very similar to traffic lights, meant stop. Just stop speaking. Let us catch up.
Sorry, what was the color of the traffic light?
Yellow
Yellow.
was warning to slow down, and red meant just stop speaking. And today, the system is called the IBM system for multilingual interpretation. Okay? So the interpreters who were worked in what they called the aquarium. There were 4 separate booths at the side of the courtroom, 4 booths for each language, a German booth, an English booth, a Russian booth, and a French booth. They were made of glass so that the interpreters could see the activity in the courtroom and they could see the speakers, because we all know that we get so much from visual gestures and communication. So they needed to be able to see them. So people said it looked like they were swimming in an aquarium or like they were in a fish tank. The teams of interpreters, there were 3 teams and they had 12 interpreters altogether. So 4 interpreters per team, 3 teams. Most of the interpreters ranged from 35 to 45 years old. They had to be bilingual. Really, they had to be better than just bilingual. They had to be almost near native in 2 languages. And there were some issues with training these interpreters at this time. Again, think about that whole timeline. 1919, Paris Peace Conference, we recognize the need for multilingual interpreters. 1941, the first interpreter training school is developed. This is 1945. There are barely any graduates yet from that interpreter training school. So the interpreters who are working at the United Nations and other places are making their career often in some other field, but they're bilingual. And so they're being recruited now to come and take on the responsibility of interpreting for this gigantic trial. And the world was watching. Everybody wanted to see what was going to happen, because just about every country around the world was involved one way or another in World War II. So the interpreters were trained, but they were trained for some 2 weeks. Some might have been trained for 2 months if they were able to get in early and get to Nuremberg with enough time to have a 2-month training. Some of them only had a few days worth of practice on the equipment or in the courtroom before the trials actually began. They did do mock trials, and they had some training to go through the system, to try it out, to test the interpreters. They did that through mock training, or mock trials. They were also able, during these training periods, to weed out those interpreters who were unable to perform. Now remember, the interpreters that they recruited might have been interpreting before at the United Nations, the League of Nations, or the Paris Peace Conference, but they were using consecutive interpreting, or at best, simultaneous successive interpreting. This was the very first time simultaneous interpreting as we know it today. Target language is interpreted at the same time as the source language, had ever happened. Those interpreters who were not capable of functioning as a simultaneous interpreter, but were bilingual, were often asked to stay in Nuremberg to work in other sections of what they called the translation unit. The translation unit included the courtroom interpreting branch, the translation branch, the court reporting branch, and the transcript reviewing branch. Lots and lots of translation and interpretation happening for this trial. So those interpreters who passed the training and actually became courtroom interpreters, there were 3 teams with 12 people. And there was also 2 bench interpreters. Remember that there were 4 judges, 1 from each country, each of the allied countries, and
There were
4 judges.
judges.
4 judges, and those 4 judges didn't speak the same languages. So besides the defendants, the witnesses, all of the lawyers, the judges needed interpreters to talk to each other as well. Okay, so in the courtroom you had 12 interpreters working at the same time. 3 interpreters at each desk. Remember there
12
was
at the same time?
12 interpreters working at the same time. 3 interpreters working in the English, at the English desk. 3 working at the French desk. 3 working at the Russian desk, and 3 at the German desk. Now remember there were 3 teams, right? So there was a team that was in the desk, in the courtroom, interpreting live. There was another team who was in the back room of the courtroom, and they were on call. They would be taking over live interpreting when the first team was done. The third team was off for the day. Most of the interpreters worked for about 85 minutes in 85-minute shifts, and then that team would be relieved. Team 1 would start the trial for that day, work for about 85 minutes, then they'd get to go take a break, and Team 2 would come in 85 minutes, Team 2 would take a break, and Team 1 would come back in. It's like our teaming today in ASL English interpretation, where one of us will start, we interpret for 20 minutes, and our partner gets up and they do 20 minutes. These were just longer shifts. So there were some issues that plagued these new interpreters in this new simultaneous mode. Some of those issues were speed, the speed at which the speakers were speaking, or if they were reading documents, sometimes it was much too fast. Maintaining accuracy of the interpretation was often an issue. Things that we experience today as ASL English interpreters, it's the same thing. The other thing to consider is the emotional content of what those interpreters had to interpret. Remember, the Nazis who were on trial for crimes against humanity, atrocities committed against other human beings, and all of that was explained during the trial. So many, many people, when they look back through history, they look at the trial, they say the only way that it could have happened, the only way to ensure that the defendants received a fair trial was by using simultaneous interpreting and creating this new interpreting mode. Because of the interpretation at the Nuremberg trials, most historians will look back and say that it was a fair trial, that the defendants received a fair trial, and that justice had, in fact, taken place. And that's the end of the lesson for today. Thanks.